So there's your core consciousness. Right. In fact, whenever we think we have, somebody else locates it elsewhere, etc. So here, I mean, I'm also basically building a straw person that I'm going to proceed to demolish.
Okay, great.
So this would be a relatively intuitive way of thinking about scales of variation across cultures, over time, across individuals. We could posit that core phenomenal consciousness is a given. Right? That it's very basic, that we all basically have the same body and the same sense modalities, that we also have the same kind of minimal intentional consciousness with some variations, and that at the narrative level, we are very, very different, or we can be. But I don't think that's a good way of thinking about it. This is rather the way in which, at least today, because I'm an episodic, remember, that I'm thinking about this. So I propose that at the level of phenomenality, at the level of body consciousness, conscious consciousness, and unconscious consciousness, there are strong variations across cultures, over time, and in individuals. I'm going to propose, and I've tried to explain it, but I don't think I'll manage to do a really good job at explaining it, that intentionality is actually the closest thing we have to a given that doesn't change very much, this kind of perspective taken, even though it can be trained to an extent. And that there are immense variations at the level of narrativity. So this is where, again, we should not assume that all selves are diachronic, that they think of themselves as the narrating author of their autobiographical lives, etc. But let's play around with other diagrammatical representations of this. So again, we have this phenomenal consciousness. And here, the thickness should not indicate any more levels of variation, right? So this sort of body awareness, intentional, narrative, etc. So the way in which I theorize those variations, why is it, and can we say, and how can we say, and how can we measure that people have very, very different experiences of their bodies? So I call this, and I apologize, it's a bit of a mouthful, but neurophenomenal recursivity. So recursivity is basically feedback loops, feedback mechanisms, right? So it may be that we're born first with phenomenal experiences, although we're encultured from the moment we are in our mother's womb and so forth. We're probably affected by narrativity in many ways that we cannot appreciate consciously, right? So there's all these recursive feedback loops, right? So ways of narrating the self, change phenomenality, but different phenomenal experience can change the way in which we narrate our lives, etc. So it's highly transient. But of course, there is something missing in this picture, right? And what is missing? And well, this is basically just one person floating in some sort of whatever intellectual vacuum. So what you need is several people. So the absolute horrible mouthful in which I feel obliged to attempt to explain this really complex, whatever it is cultural neurophenomenal recursivity. And that's basically a way to explain, I think, personhood. And I'm going to try to keep unpacking that, and I'm going to move on to actual concrete examples, because I've done something which, of course, is very pedagogically unsound. I have begun with completely abstract examples, which I'm going to proceed to attempt to exemplify. I should have done the other way around, of course. Right?
Can I ask a question about your picture?
You certainly can.
Is the white like some kind of, is that like experience? Like what? Why don't you have any connections between any of the, like I would maybe intuitively think that the light blue of one
they should merge, for sure. Yeah. So narrativity being collective, as Wittgenstein says, there being no such thing as a private language.
But my narrative is your...
Right. So yeah. So you're right. I mean, and this is why I have these question marks. I mean, what the hell? And this is when you start asking really tough questions, tough metaphysical questions about those vectors. through which narrativity travels. Because it's often so very tempting, right, to offer that language, culture, symbols, representations exist, float somewhere in the ether above our head as a super-organic entity that sort of, you can dip our heads into it as we grow taller and we grow, and then we have access to culture. But that's really not satisfactory at all. So, as unsophisticated as it is for an anthropologist to say this, I mean, I hold that culture is only ever alive in people's heads, or in people's memories, or in people's practices, etc. And then yes. So in this model, we should think that these are moving, and then you have the narrativities, exchanging different narratives and affecting each other's phenomenalities and so forth. But that would also require something that, for some strange reason, cognitive psychologists assume is always there, which is some kind of an actual physical dyad, or like a room where all of us are engaged in some kind of joint attention. So here we understand how we're sharing some kind of narrativity. But then, as people scatter, as they don't interact with one another physically, then we have more and more of a problem, right? Why does it hold? Why do we have in some moments and sometimes, very predictable, very standard ways of thinking about what it's like to be a person and feeling what it's like to be a person? So we have these vectors. What are they? Again, what is language? Right? So we have this fuzzy soup of culture. Again, the grotesque embarrassment surrounding our lack of a definition of culture. So, or is it a lump? I mean, we could also lump them all like this. It's really ugly. It's not aesthetically pleasing at all. It's not. But conceptually, it's a little bit more satisfactory, right? So our phenomenalities, just narrativities, intentionalities are always merging. And then we can speak of joint, shared intentionality. We should speak of joint and shared phenomenality, shared narrativity. We don't enough. So, we backtrack a little and propose to think of the self as a syndrome. So what is a syndrome? Anyone? A psychiatrist?
Yeah. I guess it's a constellation of signs and symptoms.
It's a constellation of, yeah, I like that very much, yes. So,
say that again.
I guess what they mean by that is that what you perceive subjectively, and then what the clinician picks up, subjective signs and subjective symptoms.
So there's a collection or a bundle of weird symptoms that don't appear to be causally related, but then if reliably different people experience the same symptoms together, we can speak of there being a syndrome, like fibromyalgia, maybe. So again, I'm going to keep suggesting that the self is basically a bundle of symptoms. It's a syndrome. There are many kinds of syndromes.
Dry skin is a symptom of a syndrome of the self.
This is a somewhat unrelated image. So then, let's proceed to unpack a little bit how symptoms are jointly mediated. So here we can get into some seemingly grotesque or perhaps painful or exotic or weird kinds of disorders or syndromes. And I think the broad variety of what we call somatoform disorders are interesting ways of thinking about that. So somatoform disorders are basically problems with bodily awareness, usually feeling that there's a missing limb, right? Feeling disconnected from particular parts of our bodies. And there is lots of controversy in psychiatry, neuroscience, psychology, and other disciplines as to the origins or the causality of these so-called somatoform disorders.
Does anorexia qualify?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if in the current nosology, in the DSM-5 or the RDocs, I'm not sure it counts as a, but I would definitely say so, yes. So let's look, for example, at xenomelia, the foreign limb syndrome, right? So this is characterized by the non-acceptance of one or more of our extremities and the resulting desire, the frenzy, the obsession, even, with wanting to amputate that limb. And this has been documented since, for sure, we know the late 19th century, and reportedly there are cases of people who held physicians at gunpoint demanding that their limbs be amputated. So the condition was originally called, it was considered a psychological or psychiatric disorder, but of course, after the decade of the brain and so forth, there have been many, and by the view of some scientists, failed attempts to locate particular pathologies in the brain. So I read a paper recently about asomatognosia being linked with some deficiencies in the salience network, the default mode network, etc. But mostly, no neural correlates have been found. Right? So here I am referencing a very interesting 2013 paper in Frontiers in Psychology, trying to articulate a social neuroscience view of altered bodily self-consciousness. Now, here's another one of my favorites, apotemnophilia. So, this is a somatoform disorder that takes on sexual dimensions. It's a kind of paraphilia, right? So paraphilia is usually some kind of, again, a desire to get rid of limbs or to fetishize particular parts of the body for sexual purposes. So first, it describes a search for amputees at sexual partners, and fantasies and wishes to be amputated linked to sexual arousal. Now, this is another early paper. This one is in French, and they're also not finding any sort of neural brain causes for this. And they're actually asking interesting social questions. They don't reference Foucault or the history of sexuality, but they seem to be asking questions. They seem to, if not take it for granted, seriously consider that body image, the desirability of particular body shapes or forms, but also the particular sexual desirability of different body parts is certainly historically, culturally contingent and mediated. And they note from interviewing patients that it seems that people who desperately, for sexual reasons or not, want to get rid of some parts of their bodies do this because they want to achieve this true self. So they're already partaking in some kind of a dominant cultural narrative of what it's like to be a self, to be an ideal self, to be a true self. And they're conforming to different kinds of dominant body ideals. Right? So here in this 2007 paper, they conclude that those body identification disorders, they have no intrinsic psychopathological meaning. They are, and this is the author's conclusion, new ways to be mad. Now, for those of you who are in cultural or psychiatry and medical anthropology, or the philosophy of these disciplines, you may be familiar with Ian Hacking's famous notion of transient mental illnesses, right? So Ian asks, why did we have, again, everything sort of pops up. In the 19th century, we have fugue states, right? People who enter some kind of a mad trance and who start walking, they hit the road and they just can't stop anymore, right? We have a French butcher from Bordeaux in the late 1900s who makes it to Russia somehow, right? Some of them die of exhaustion. Then we have women with hysterical leg paralyses. We have people with automatic writing. Then we have peak and descent and downfall of multiple personality disorders. So again, why do we have these ways of being mad? Why do we have these symptoms, these new distressing bodily sensations that seem to appear and disappear throughout history? So here, with this quote, we go back to more mainstream or current neuroscientific examinations of empathy, of intersubjectivity, right? So there's interesting work, for example, with humans and baboons on contagious yawning and or contagious itching. Now, none of this should be groundbreaking to any of us. I mean, if you've ever cried in a movie, right? If you've ever engaged with any kind of, again, imaginary situation and felt something that another person, even a fictitious one, is feeling, you're engaging in those, what I call those minimal mechanisms of intersubjectivity. So this is a way, this is telesomatic perception. This is a way of mediating bodily symptoms, sometimes at a distance. So this is from the xenophilia paper. We don't need to go into all of these, but they try to look at, again, the cultural bound norms of body appearance and modification. They try to ground the desire to either get rid of one's limbs or sexualize them or sexualize the amputation in an epidemiology of ideas. But I want to go back a little to talking about intersubjectivity, telesomatic perception, so being able to feel something by basically through contagion, doing so at a distance. But then I also want to talk about feeling some things in parts of bodies that we don't have. So this is what I, and I'm sure other people that didn't Google it, call parasomatic perception. Does anybody recognize the experiment here? Yeah?
No, that's the rubber hand.
Maxwell, you want to tell us about the rubber hand experiment?
Well, the rubber hand experiment is interesting because it's an experiment where sense of agency and sense of, I think it's like bodily, well, the bodily correlate of the minimal self kind of uncoupled in a strange way. The basic idea is, so you have a setup, right, where what you see is a rubber hand, and your own hand is hidden, right? So you got your box here, you put your hand in, right? And the only thing you can see is a rubber hand, so your hand is, like I said...
You see one of your real hands, and right. A rubber hand next to it that looks as though it's your hand, but
right,
you know
exactly.
It's a rubber hand.
Well,
okay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you can tell, right? It doesn't have to be super realistic for the effect to happen. So what happens is you basically stroke the rubber hand, and in the right circumstances, you're going to feel that where you feel your hand is actually shifted towards the rubber hand, right? So what this shows is that bodily integrity is something that's like a constant accomplishment of the nervous system, right? So you can actually trick the body, and it has to do with how the nervous system is weighing information. So what the nervous system, what the visual system is seeing is, oh, well, there's this stroking motion that's touching the hand, and you're also feeling it, and you're feeling it, right? So it just makes more sense, like to resolve the difference. Your bodily representation is basically shifted towards the hand, right? So,
right. So yeah, go on.
Sorry, so if they had moved their hand and into a different position behind the board, they would stop feeling it?
It's a very fleeting illusion, so you know, it can be broken.
Yes, I think.
Right.
Move your hand and this hand is not moving.
Yeah,
the
the
illusion
illusion
exactly.
disappears immediately.
Right.
That's it. Okay.
So,
but again, this requires no specific training in any kind of hypnosis or absorption.
Yeah.
So some people might call it a maladaptive function of the brain. I think on the contrary, it's just a wonderfully creative and adaptive way of feeling things outside of your own body. Right? I mean, to put it in very, very simple terms. So parasomatic is a fancy way of saying just outside or around the body. Yes, Isha.
Recently, they followed this up with stroking an invisible part of the virtual reality camera and stroking an individual. And the person starts to identify their body with no body. It's like invisible space.
Wow.
And then that's really weird.
Right.
It's the whole body, not just your body part. So interesting.
So this is why some of you know that I'm quite enthusiastic and optimistic about the brain in a vat thought experiment. I hold that as long as one is skilled and in brain as using a particular body, given the technological capacity, one might be able to feel as though one has a body, right? So, and we have plenty of evidence for phantom pain, which I find absolutely wonderful, right? So this is an old German 1967 paper, paraplegic patient, so cannot feel the lower part of their body, yet they're having phantom pains, including sexual sensations, and a full orgasm. Right? So I find this wonderful. So So now we were thinking about para or extrasomatic phantom sensations. So again, and we're going to go back to this when we talk about tulpas, but think about what it's like to feel a presence. Right? So I had my moment of self-pity at the beginning of this lecture. I spoke of my dearly departed dog friend, Echo, and my feeling her outside of my body all the time, right? Feeling her coming behind me, feeling things just outside my body, and it just occurred to me, I'm having these phantom pains outside my body. These are some phenomenal experiences. So it's not as though I'm feeling her presence, as though she's touching me. I'm feeling something outside my body. If that makes any sense. To me it does. Okay. So now, let's go back to some questions that the social neuroscientists investigating xenophilia were investigating is, well, why does it appear to be on the rise, right? Why do these somatoform disorders in some places appear to be on the rise? So again, are we realist about this? Did we have many people lurking about out there with those symptoms, and we just did not have the proper diagnostic tools to identify what they had? Or is it that there are ways in which they come together and jointly negotiate, jointly shape each other's symptoms? So this is an interesting question. I hope that some of us are asking in our examination of Cyberchondria. So you Google your symptoms, you go to WebMD, and you have, let's say you have some kind of weird paresthesia, like tingling in your eyelids, etc. You start reading about it, and you read about multiple sclerosis or fibromyalgia. Then you join the fibromyalgia forum. Next thing you know, you're getting updates every day. You're talking to people maybe offline, and then you're beginning to, in a sense, have fibromyalgia. Right? Chronic fatigue, etc. Your symptoms change, you find it reassuring, you have a community of people who experience the same things. So, are there ways in which the internet could be sort of a metaphor for the way in which ideas and so forth spread virally, except doing it more efficiently, right? So, there's a lot of interesting ideas there, and we can't unpack all of them, right? But how do we merge empathically with others? So we know that touch and vision are very important, but there are other ways. Even Merleau-Ponty himself, of the phenomenology of perception, claimed that language was one of those vectors, was one of those vehicles for intersubjectivity. So prosumption, it's an old term that the sociologist George Witzer, who examines McDonaldization and the standardization of culture, picked up. Right? It's a way of producing and consuming at the same time. Right? So how do we prosume being members of a given society? So cyberspace-mediated prosumption, from the perspective of some scholars, myself included, is one of those, certainly not new, but perhaps more efficient or more aggressive way of mediating each other's symptoms. So I've only spoken about pathology, and I'm going to fly through a couple more pathological examples, but here, again, to recap, I'm speaking about culture, so ways of being persons together, works virally through telesomatic perception. So I'm grounding culture in bodily experiences that we come to share, that we come to jointly mediate. So imitation, contagion, mirror, whatever, suggestion. So this is another idea a dormant idea of mine for a while. I was always interested in Munchausen syndrome by proxy, right? But then it was a lecture by Lawrence Kermeyer that made me think that Munchausen syndrome by proxy is an excellent paradigm to describe cultural neurophenomenal recursivity, or to describe culture for short. Right? So this is my definition of culture, Munchausen by proxy, the same thing. This is what I claim. So what is it, again? So Munchausen syndrome, it's a behavior pattern in which a caregiver is said to fabricate, to exaggerate, or to induce particular mental or physical symptoms in those who are in their care. So it was first identified by psychoanalytically trained physicians, and like most of psychoanalysis, it's usually a way of blaming the mother, right? So it's often described as an overly anxious mother who's, instead of being a hypochondriac herself, project her own hypochondria onto her child. So it's an interesting form of collective, differentiated embodied delusion. So it's a delusion that involves different people. We say that the mother is ill, mentally ill, right? But she makes her child ill as well. And I'm trying to think about how that works, and again, reflecting back on my own life, I started toying with the idea that perhaps I too was a perpetrator of Munchausen by proxy. So, without getting into too much detail, my 7-year-old son who lives under my care, much like myself when I was a child and my father before me, suffers from chronic migraines. So his migraines started as very weird, scary neurological symptoms, blurred vision, vomiting, extreme photosensitivity, and then he usually basically passes out and wakes up and he's fine, right? And there were no particular patterns to his migraines. So I started thinking, is it linked to abandonment or particular things like that? And I started thinking and worrying, and suddenly, but never quite, almost discussing with him, does it have something to do with perhaps what I believe? Now, of late, he has begun to have migraines very predictably when I go on a business trip. And I used to think, okay, well, that's an interesting pattern, etc. And now I'm realizing that I'm probably, if not consciously, very actively mediating this. I have shaped the predictability, the frequency of his experience. Now, where am I getting all these ideas from? Surely I'm a caregiver. I love my son, and I'm not that interested in deconstructing the historically transient notions of childhood and infanthood, etc. At the same time, right? There are particular ideas about nuclear families, about dyads, about attachment, about this and that, things that always trying to compensate. Right? So was I, inadvertently, a victim, but much more a perpetrator of my son's migraines? Right? So I've involved many people in this particular delusion, himself included. But why is this a good way to think about culture? Because, first of all, it's power-laden. There are some differences of power. But here we're not going to be paranoid, pseudo-Marxists. There's no conspiracy. So again, the parent does not actively want to hypnotize their child and induce symptoms. Yet, by virtue of some certainly socio-cultural historical mechanism, they have power over their child. So there's those imbalances. Not that the child is a passive victim. The child also mediates. There might be ways in which a child mediates or projects symptom onto a parent. So there's some kind of semi-intentional, and here I mean intentional in the sense of I intend to do this, not completely intentionality, although intentionality has a lot to do with it. But, so there's the semi-intentional, joint, hierarchical, differentiated, power-laden mediation and imposition of symptoms and ways of narrativizing symptoms. So now, if you have followed me so far, and if you don't think I'm completely crazy, this sounds very suspiciously like ways of being a self. It feels like something, right? So maybe I'm feeling my posture, I'm feeling my masculinity or my insecurities about my masculinities, in particular conscious or subconscious ways of whatever. I narrate, I pseudo-narrate, I lose consciousness. But there's a difference between Munchausen by proxy or xenophilia and what it's like to be Samuel speaking right now. It's a difference of degrees, not of kinds. And of course, these symptoms are drawn, mediated from an ideological repertoire. So here's the good news for me. The good news is that, like Munchausen syndrome by proxy, well, culture and personhood, they're diagnosable. Right? And here I'm going to be quite enthusiastic about diagnostic psychiatry, diagnostic cultural psychiatry. We had great discussions today at Emola in the cultural psychiatry seminar with one of our great student and friends, Vito, a Brazilian psychiatrist who does a lot of theater with his patients, and he couldn't make it now. But we decided that cultural psychiatry is about applying psychiatry to culture. We don't treat symptoms, we don't treat people, we treat culture. It was some sort of a crypto-Maoist attempt to say, well, you know, what we need to do is change the culture, diagnose the culture, as it were. So we can identify, we can address those semi-intentional mediation mechanisms and their actors, of course, right? So I would like to think that Mateus, myself, that Mateus is my son, maybe there's ways in which we can change. We could maybe get rid of the migraines altogether. We can address the ideological regimes. And of course, phenomenal and narrative consciousness, well, they can be altered. Do you have a question?
Yeah,
of course.
Question. So, I mean, I guess the talk of culture and personhood being diagnosable sounds definitely very politically suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, I guess I'm curious sort of what you mean by that, but also would that mean that we can diagnose in the sense that we can pick out models of culture and models of personhood which are either more pathological or less desirable,
yes, I will say
by
that.
some sort of universal account or universal sort of categorization of
No, maybe
cultures?
maybe not universal,
or
but
nosology of